We have about 10 minutes left only, and I wanted to still take the opportunity to hear from the floor. Being conscious of the fact that we only have 10 minutes, I would really ask that if anybody would like to make any comments or questions to the panel or any interventions, that they be kept short, please. So can I see a show of hands, and then I will know? Okay, so we have 1, 2, and 3 and 4, and I think then after that I might have to close. We'll see how we go. Okay, go ahead.
Hi, good morning. My first question, I haven't been able to read the report. I'll do it as soon as it arrives to my hand. If there is any specific recommendation or policies applied to the group of children within LGBTI groups, and how is this being addressed, the specific situation of children?
Yeah, so I just wanted to point out there's a small gap in the ISHR report. So it notes problems faced by human rights defenders in its text, violence, threats, denigration. But it doesn't actually make any recommendations specific to defenders. The Jakarta principles now tell us about the importance of such provisions. So you have Principle 27, which provides for the right to protect human rights. That's specifically aimed at LGBT human rights defenders. And my point is, when you're silent on this question, you allow for a facially progressive regime to have indirectly discriminatory practices vis-a-vis LGBT defenders. So to give you an instance, India had a really progressive judgment in 2014 dealing with transgender rights. And the judgment enshrined the Jakarta principles in domestic law in certain ways. That's been very good for us in certain ways, but what that's also meant is that you have a lot of trans defenders who are targeted under other regimes. So you had a healthcare HIV/AIDS worker who was implicated on false kidnapping charges and then was later harassed by the police to the point of committing suicide. You had another instance where you had defenders who were rounded up under a vagrancy, beggary, prohibition law. So you have the law that is very progressive on the face of it, but it's being applied in a discriminatory kind of way. So.
Just before we move on to the next one, I forgot to ask if you could introduce yourself before you speak. So
Sure. Yeah, so my name is Danish Sheikh. I'm from the Alternative Law Forum.
Thank you. And you?
My name is Neus Jimeno. I'm from NGO Liaison Unit.
Thank you. And now we move to the back with Cynthia. So if you could introduce yourself and also to speak a bit slowly for the interpretation.
Sure.
Thank you.
Okay. Hi, my name is Cynthia Rothschild, and I'm an independent activist and consultant. I'm based in New York. Thank you all for the insight. I'd love to ask you 2 questions, but I'm going to try to limit this to 1 in the name of time. One of the things that the report says pretty clearly, it condemns political rhetoric used to antagonize either LGBT people or antagonize based on sexuality or sexual orientation or gender identity. I wonder if I could just ask each of you to talk about how antagonism toward sexuality generally, or LGBTI people and organizations, including women's organizations. I'd like to ask you, I think, to come out of the soggy box for a second and talk a little bit more about what you think the function is in your own state of clampdowns on dissent, and make the connection between the LGBTI piece and what political function you think the attack that's manifested through attacks on LGBTI organizations and defensive rights, what in your specific spaces, how does that connect to clampdowns on dissent in your particular space? And I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thank you. My name is Dawn Kavanagh, and I'm from the Coalition of African Lesbians. I'm not sure if it's a question or a comment, or maybe it's an observation, and it's both linked to the report and the attitude, I suppose, of the report, as well as some really powerful statements that came from some people on the panel, particularly Kenita, and I think Zhan also on mainstreaming and talking about other movements that we work with, referencing, people with disabilities. And maybe just, because I think sometimes the idea of intersectionality becomes a bit distorted. So often we're looking to others, and I'm a lesbian woman. It's not the only thing I am. It's like a very small piece of my life. But often we expect others to mainstream and to integrate, but often we are in our own little narrow identity box. And so when we talk about people with disabilities, it's not them, we are. Many of us have disabilities. When we talk about women's rights, many of us are women, so I don't know in terms of your own work and the recommendations that you have for people working on sexuality and gender, and specifically on SOGI, because this is the theme, how we can overcome this. I mean, often we try to distance ourselves from exceptionalism, but we feed into it by talking about trans rights. Yeah, we don't talk about human rights of trans people. We don't talk about LGBTI, we say LGBTI rights, and yet that is kind of feeding into the notion that there's some separate category. So I think both for policymakers and decision makers in the room, but as well as for people from other movements, what is it that how can you guide us about how to resist falling into the trap of these contradictions, where we say, we don't want exception, like there's not something special that we're asking for, but often where the language, and I think the report unfortunately falls into this very trap of that narrow identity politic.
Thank you. We have 5 minutes left, so the reactions from the panelists to these very excellent questions, in fact, I don't know how you will manage, but you have to in 1 minute each. Thank you.
You guys ask really hard questions. So I just want to say that I guess the lucky thing about, well, in my experience, people who work on LGBTI human rights is that because of the path to that work, people pick up specialities and skills in other work. And so a lot of us have crossover skills. And I think this is where the language of working with different sections of human rights can become useful. So, and my secret wish in my time at ILGA working on gender identity and gender expression is that I would like to have the gender dialogue at the UN open up, to not just be about women and girls. And I would like to see, the dialogue include transmasculine people as well, which, it hasn't happened yet, but that would be a great thing. Cynthia's question is so difficult, I don't know. I don't know, I have to think about it, sorry.
Okay. I think Don and I had this conversation just recently about the language, and I think as human rights defenders, it's a case that we have to be conscious of it. When I speak to collaborations with other defenders, it doesn't take me out as being a defender of that passion. However, recognizing where my priority of work may be is understanding that I'm not necessarily trying to take over your space, but just trying to join it. And I think as human rights defenders, it is a case that we have to be conscious when we speak about gay rights or LGBT rights. And more often than not, I withdraw from that kind of language because I believe that it sets in people's mind that we are actually writing up new rights for ourselves, and which causes more issues than solving any. And I think the idea of the human rights of LGBT persons or human rights of individuals on a whole is where our language should actually be seated. It has shown itself in the Caribbean and many parts where they try to use the language like, what exactly are we trying? What are these special rights? And when we say we're asking for nothing special, we need to be clear as to how we frame what we put out there, and each one has to own it. I think in the territory of working across the broader issues in terms of political will and other organizations in countries, my experience in St. Lucia was that United and Strong probably would not have been a registered NGO today if it was actually framed as a LGBT organization. The lawyers which worked with us had to have been very creative, especially understanding that buggery is still on the books. And I probably would not even go into how we got registered, but the fact that we are there, governments and other NGOs, it's a little problematic for them because, I mean, we got registered in 2005, and up until 2009 at our constitution reform, people did not know this organization existed. And what we have gotten is a lot of background checks into how we exist, who is funding us, and stuff like that. What we have seen is the organization that's considered to be a women's organization in name has worked with us, but in practicality hasn't implemented anything with us. And I think that it is because, again, understanding the security, understanding who is funding them, and they do get a government subvention, which we don't. And that says it. So with a lot of our groups, we are clamped down by whether we are able to get government subventions, whether some of them are allowed to get registered. And a lot of the groups are underground, so groups like United and Strong actually present as fiscal sponsors for a lot of those who cannot necessarily be out and visible.
Cuando hablaba de reforzar el tema intersex dentro de las recomendaciones, creo que uno de los puntos a los que me refería básicamente es el tema de la niñez, de niños y niñas intersex, porque precisamente son los niños y niñas intersex quienes están siendo mutilados alrededor del mundo.
When she was referring to reinforcing the recommendations on intersex people, she was also referring to the recommendations on the children, because they're the vulnerable ones, they are the ones who are being mutilated.
La mayoría de las cirugías son hechas desde antes de que cumplan el primer año de edad, y eso es algo que tenemos que seguir denunciando y es algo que tenemos que reforzar dentro de estas recomendaciones.
Most of the surgeries they suffer is usually when they're younger than 1 year old, and that's one of the things we have to denounce the most.
Solo para terminar, sí diría que garantizar los derechos humanos de las poblaciones LGBTI es garantizar los derechos de la humanidad. No podemos seguir pensando de que son los derechos de los otros, sino que son nuestros derechos, los derechos de toda la humanidad.
So to finish, I would like to say that guaranteeing LGBTI's human rights is to guarantee the rights of the humanity. So we don't have to continue thinking that it's the other's rights, but that is also our rights.
I think in terms of language, that's a very good and very valid point, because these issues do need to be addressed in all mainstream settings, and I think Zhan made a great point to state in terms of when they address different issues in terms of health and education and a variety of other things, that they make sure that they're cognizant of the LGBTI community, and when they're progressing human rights, whether it's human rights for all people. I think it's going to be this delicate balance between mainstreaming human rights for LGBTI people, as well as, while at the same time bringing out the specific marginalization that is faced by the LGBTI community that is not necessarily faced by other communities in the same way. I think that for this purpose, it would be probably very useful to learn from the women's movement. You know, we have specific procedures and structures and mechanisms in the UN that deal very specifically with the human rights of women. But being cognizant of the fact that they face this additional layer of marginalization, and so need an additional layer of attention and focus on their issues. And we need the same kind of additional systematic attention on LGBTI issues because of this marginalization. And the fact that we're trying to provide that additional layer should not be seen as the fact that there's a separate set of rights. You know, when we're talking about women's rights, when you're talking about LGBTI rights, I mean, we really are talking about the human rights of certain marginalized groups, and providing attention to them because of this marginalization. So I think it's just about kind of, you know, finding the balance between those two things, but not letting kind of concerns around attention in mainstream spaces to stop us from pushing for a systematic attention to our issues. In terms of the political rhetoric, I think that's, you know, like has been mentioned by some of the panelists, we're easy targets. And we do see an increase or a spike in violence around elections, and I think that it is used as we're scapegoats. You know, it's easy to campaign and bring attention on, you know, LGBTI people and kind of try and reduce the amount, you know, the conversation around service delivery or any other aspect that might be problematic for the government. So I think that's definitely linked to that. And yeah, in terms of you know, children, I think also what stuck out for me was the recommendation specifically around intersex children, and I think it's really great that there's been increased attention on the normalization surgeries on intersex infants. But I think that the conversation needs to be broadened because I haven't seen as much being said about intersex adolescents. And there's a great move in terms of informed consent that's very encouraging, but we don't talk about so much children that are old enough to provide consent but not an adult under law, and what full, free, and informed consent means for those children. Because if throughout their lives they have been mostly exposed to very medicalized, pathologizing language and haven't had any other information outside of medical settings, which they're likely to have interacted with repeatedly throughout their lives, is the consent really free and you know, informed? And I think I'd love to see, in terms of children's rights, best practices come out around how to ensure that at whichever age that intersex children start being consulted about decisions around their bodies, making sure that's done in a free and fully informed way.
Thank you very much. Unfortunately, I don't really have time to make closing remarks because we're already over time. But I think that clearly a lot of these discussions will need to continue, particularly the questions that came from the floor were really interesting and require also some self-reflection. And yeah, thank you again for coming today. And we look forward to having more spaces like this to have further dialogue on these issues here at the Human Rights Council.